welcome to this episode of Live with Lizzie, powered by the China Project. I'm your host, Lizzie. Joining me today is Professor Taisu Zhang from Yale Law School. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you. Glad to be here.
So, Professor Zhang, in a recent foreign affairs essay, you argue that China's rulers can no longer safely rely on economic performance as their primary source of political legitimacy. So what are the alternatives to economic performance?
Well, so right now, I'm not sure there is a completely fully reliable alternative. So the couple of examples that the couple of alternatives that the Chinese government has been experimenting with, and none of these have yet been proven to be fully adequate, but they've been experimenting with perhaps moderate levels of success, are basically some other version of what you would call performance-based legitimacy. If you can't get economic growth in a terribly reliable fashion, maybe you try to say boost social equality, boost welfare. Alternatively, you could sometimes try to invest in environmental issues and so on and so forth. The problem with those things is that to a large extent, your ability to actually make those kinds of investments depends on your economic performance. So if you don't have the relatively high levels of fiscal income that fast economic growth provides, investing in welfare programs, investing in anti-poverty initiatives, or even investing in environmental change correction policies is not necessarily going to be that cost effective, because it's going to be hard for you to scale up when your fiscal circumstances are not strong. So the second thing they've tried to do basically is to play into the Chinese nationalist narrative. This takes a couple of forms. So there's more aggressive foreign policy making, which everyone outside of China has been noticing pretty well. There's a kind of a general narrative of industrial strength, of technological innovation, and so on and so forth. But again, the problem is that this is not so functionally separate from economic performance per se, because unlike some other forms of nationalism, the kinds that you see, for example, in India, or perhaps the kinds that you see in Western Europe, or frankly, even in the US, the current version of Chinese nationalism is unusually closely aligned with economic performance. It's not kind of like rooted in some sense of cultural uniqueness. It's not necessarily rooted in kind of like a value system-based narrative. It's basically a narrative of military strength, material strength, and economic power. So, which means that, like in times of plenty, you have this narrative building on top of good economic performance, and the political benefits of your economic performance get amplified. When economic performance begins to slow down, when perhaps even as might have happened over parts of the past year, at least it turns negative, then this is not really much of an adequate substitute, because nationalist sentiment weakens pretty sharply. National sentiment of this kind weakens pretty sharply once it loses its material foundation. So the problem with both the kind of like welfarist or environmentalist narrative or the nationalist narrative is that within their core logics, they're not so separatable.
Right.
They're not so separable from like raw economic performance itself. So they can't really substitute for that in terms of politics when economic performance begins to slow down. The third thing they've been experimenting with is basically what Xi has been calling like 依法治国, like ruling the country according to law, which has been a major initiative since 2013, 14-ish. And there, the idea is that, well, at least we can make the government more legalistic.
Right.
We can make the government run more according to written laws and make it more professionalized, more formalistic, more predictable. Now, all of this has long-term economic benefits, but that's not the real main point. The real main point is basically to give state behavior a certain kind of like legal veneer, an aura of legality that it otherwise wouldn't necessarily have. And the underlying political rationale behind this is that in and of itself can be a source of political legitimacy, even when all else fails.
Fascinating, fascinating. In the article, you were careful to point out that legality is not the same as a rule of law, but is legality a substitute for the rule of law in some sense, or is it still not quite there?
Right. So legality, as you say, is not definitely not the rule of law. The rule of law is more a political concept than a legalistic one. Right? Like it's more about basically whether every major actor in a political system is checked in a substantive way by some kind of legal rule. Now, in the case of China, there are certain power wielding entities, most notably the Central Party leadership, that simply is not expressly bound by Chinese law in any meaningful fashion. Like the fact they're not bound by law is not illegal. It's just the law doesn't purport to reach the kind of authority they wield. So it's not a rule of law system in kind of like a traditional Western definition. That doesn't mean it's not legalistic. Now, your question is, can legality substitute for the rule of law? Well, it can't, right? Like, like the two things are just functionally different. Like no amount of legality under the legal terms as provided for in Chinese law right now is actually going to provide a meaningful check on the party leadership's power. And that's the way that things are designed to be. So because of all that, they can't substitute, but in the realm of public opinion, and whether it can provide just as powerful a boost to the party's perceived legitimacy, that's a different question. And there, I think the signs are somewhat positive, right? So one thing that I've been doing in terms of research over the past couple of years is I've been running these experiments with a couple of co-authors, political scientists at Stanford, on whether you can have positive social reactions positive social reactions in the Chinese context to investments in legality, even when it doesn't compare with anything that you would actually call the rule of law. And what we found is actually the answer is this. This might not be true for lots of other countries. People have argued that it's not true, for example, in the US or in Western Europe, where basically rule of law matters much more than legality, and pure legality is not terribly socially well received when it's not paired with the rule of law. We have not found that to be the case in China. We have found that pure legality in and of itself, when basically all you need to do is just enforce written rules and make sure people who are subject to the rules follow the rules. As long as you do that, you get a boost. The more you do that, the bigger the boost. And even if that means that you leave a considerable chunk of the highest policymakers in the land unchecked in their power, you still get a boost, right? So the core message, I think, is that the legitimacy enhancing effects of legality are not dependent on having the rule of law. You can have them without actually providing the rule of law.
Fascinating. Just to be concrete, can you give us some examples of how Xi Jinping and his lieutenants are, relying on legality or relying on the law to solidify their legitimacy?
Right. So over the past, at this point, 9 years now, they've made a large number of investments in kind of boosting the overall stature of the courts vis-a-vis other organs of Chinese governments. So it used to be that courts were pretty much like the ugly stepchild in the Chinese system. They were poorly paid, didn't have terribly high status, were fiscally beholden to parallel levels of governments, and so they had nothing that you would describe of as functional independence. Since 2014, the central government's been making considerable investments to try to boost their independence. So the idea is they actually want local courts to be able to act as some kind of substantive check on the power of local governments. Now, so not only have they made courts more fiscally independent, they've boosted the salaries and the kind of internal political stature of judges. They've also given them more review powers over administrative actions, most notably over land takings. So everyone knows this is the major purse string in Chinese local governments. You mainly make money off of selling land. They've since 2014. The local courts, parallel to any system of local government, have gained pretty major review powers over any land taking activity done by parallel governments. And so that makes them considerably powerful players at the local level. It gives them a certain kind of legalistic ability to check the activities of local officials. So I think in the end, what this kind of tells us is that legality for the party leadership is certainly not a way to check its own power. They're never going to make that kind of investment. But it's a way to make sure everyone else pretty much follows orders.
Right.
And by following orders, they probably mean like they think of law, frankly, as a source of order, and it's a source of order not merely against the population at large, but perhaps even more importantly, it's a source of order against lower level officials, all the way down to like the ministry level.